Something happened in the winter of 1497 that most history books pass over quietly. Luca Pacioli, the Franciscan friar who essentially invented modern bookkeeping, wrote a detailed letter to a colleague in Venice. In it, he laid out the exact financial position of his patron, Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan. Assets, liabilities, structural weaknesses, the timing of obligations coming due. All of it written with the precision of a man who knew numbers intimately and understood power not at all. Within 2 years, Ludovico had lost Milan to the French. Historians debate the causes: military miscalculation, diplomatic failure, shifting alliances across a peninsula that had perfected the art of the strategic betrayal. But the archives record something that rarely appears in the footnotes. The contents of that letter, and others like it, circulated further than Pacioli intended, and people who received that information used it in the way that people have always used detailed intelligence about a rival's weakness. I am not claiming a letter cost a man his duchy. I am claiming that the mechanism it illustrates has not changed in 500 years. Not in Rome, not in Florence, not in the commercial corridors of Amsterdam, not in the boardrooms and dinner tables and social feeds of today. The same transfer of vulnerability through information, the same predictable consequences. There are 7 things you should never reveal about yourself to anyone, not to protect secrets, not because you are doing anything that requires concealment, not because the world is populated exclusively by people of hostile intent, but because certain categories of information shared in the wrong context do not build connection or trust or opportunity. They shift the informational balance in ways you cannot see and cannot predict and cannot reverse. And that shifting has costs that accumulate quietly over years in ways that are difficult to trace back to their origin. The archives have been recording those costs for 3,000 years. Today, we read them together. Before we go further, let me be honest about what I am and what I am not. I have no license that entitles me to direct your financial decisions. I have not met you. I do not know your obligations, your situation, your particular history, your relationships, the specific texture of the life you are navigating. What I have is the record, the long, patient, deeply unimpressed record of how human beings have managed and mismanaged the information they share about themselves across centuries of documented experience, across civilizations that rose and fell, across individuals who succeeded and failed and succeeded again. That record does not require a license. It requires attention. The first thing you should never reveal is how much you earn. I know. This one already sounds like the advice your cautious uncle gave you at a family gathering. Bear with me, because the mechanism behind it is not what most people assume. The argument for income transparency is straightforward and not without merit. When people know what their colleagues earn, they can identify unfair disparities and advocate for themselves. That argument is real. It applies in specific, structured, collective contexts, and it is not wrong. But there is a fundamental difference between systemic, anonymized wage data, which serves collective negotiation, and your specific income number, disclosed in personal and social contexts, where it serves no structural purpose whatsoever. In 15th century Florence, the Medici banking network operated on a principle of strict internal compartmentalization. Individual bankers knew their own compensation, and in most cases, nothing more. Not the earnings of their peers, not the full picture of the firm's profitability, only what was necessary for their own function. This was not cruelty or distrust, it was deliberate architecture. Because the Medici, after generations of managing complex organizations with complicated human beings inside them, understood something that modern management has had to rediscover repeatedly, often painfully. When income differentials become socially known, they stop being an organizational condition and become a social condition. And social conditions are governed by entirely different rules than organizational ones. Rules that no policy document can override once they have been activated. Modern research confirms this with uncomfortable precision. Studies examining thousands of workers across different industries and cultures found that discovering a colleague earns more, not dramatically more, even marginally more, predicts disengagement more reliably than workload, management quality, or lack of promotion. The effect is not primarily about fairness as an abstract principle. It is about recalibration, the internal recalculation of where one stands and what the relationship means and what is owed to whom. Here is what recalibration means in practice. The moment someone knows what you earn, every interaction you have with them is now filtered through that number. Every purchase you make is quietly audited against it. Every complaint you voice is measured against it. Every request you make for flexibility, for help, for consideration, for grace in a difficult moment is calculated against it. You have not shared information. You have provided the architecture of a new calculation, and you will live inside that calculation whether you intended it or not, and for longer than you anticipated. Meet Marcus, 47 years old, senior project manager at a mid-sized technology firm. Participated in a company transparency initiative 2 years ago and disclosed his salary openly, enthusiastically, believing it would create fairness and connection. 18 months later, he is navigating a team that treats his compensation as the context for every professional decision he makes. A family that has quietly revised its expectations upward and finds it difficult to hear him describe any financial constraint as genuine. A social circle that has assigned him a financial identity he did not choose and cannot easily correct. Colleagues who once asked for his professional judgment now ask with an expectation calibrated to that number, and the number precedes him into every room. Marcus does not have a privacy problem. He has a recalibration problem. A problem he created with a single disclosure in a context that did not require it, and that will follow him through professional relationships for years. The exit is not silence in every context. It is context discipline. Your income is a data point that belongs in specific, purposeful contexts: salary negotiations, financial planning conversations, formal applications, certain professional assessments where accuracy is both required and protected by structure. Outside those contexts, the number is not social currency. It is not a marker of authenticity or openness or trust. It is operational information. And operational information performs best when its circulation is controlled and its audience is deliberate. The second thing you should never reveal is what you are worth. In the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller maintained a practice so consistent it approached doctrine. The full picture of his financial position, his actual net worth, his liquid reserves, the true architecture of his asset structure, was known at any given time to perhaps 4 or 5 people, his senior lawyers. A small, carefully chosen circle of trusted advisors, not his extended family, not his wide social network, not the philanthropic boards on which he sat, some of the most powerful institutional gatherings in the country. This was not false modesty. Rockefeller was not a modest man by any measure. It was strategic clarity, cultivated from watching many fortunes destroyed across decades, and identifying the specific mechanism that most often initiated the destruction. The historical pattern across centuries is consistent enough to call a law. Disclosed wealth produces 3 categories of response, and only one of them is neutral. The first is recalibration. People adjust what they expect of you, what they ask of you, what they believe you owe the world and them specifically. This happens often without malice. The person doing it frequently has no awareness of doing it at all. They simply reconfigure their model of the relationship to account for the new information, and that reconfigured model persists, unchanged, independent of your actual circumstances in the months and years that follow. The second is extraction. Requests for loans, for investments, for partnerships, for introductions, multiply with sudden frequency. Opportunities with opaque risk-reward structures appear, brought by people who seem credible, and whose interest in you is now, upon reflection, clearly connected to the information you disclosed. Family dynamics shift in directions that are genuinely difficult to navigate and nearly impossible to reverse once the new expectations have been established. The third, the one most consistently underestimated across the historical record, is quiet, ambient targeting. Not dramatic conspiracies, small structural adjustments made by people who are simply doing what rational actors do when they have better information than the party across from them. The insurance adjuster whose estimates run slightly higher for the client who mentioned, at a social gathering, that he has had a good run lately. The contractor who quotes a different number for the homeowner who lets slip in an offhand remark over coffee that things are going well. The negotiator who enters a conversation with a different opening position because someone, somewhere, gave them a clearer picture of your situation than you intended. When your approximate wealth is broadly known, you have surrendered informational asymmetry. And informational asymmetry is, in negotiation and in most practical transactions of life, one of the few structural advantages available to the private individual who lacks institutional scale. The principle is not deception. You do not misrepresent yourself in contexts that require accurate disclosure. You do not evade formal assessments that serve legitimate purposes. A lender, an insurer, a formal business partner conducting structured due diligence. These are appropriate contexts for accurate information, and accuracy in them is both required and right. The principle is that your net worth is not a social fact. It is a private operating condition, and private operating conditions perform best when they remain private. The third thing you should never reveal is what you owe. If the first 2 concerns involve the disclosure of strength, this one concerns something more consequential: the disclosure of vulnerability. In ancient Rome, there was a legal mechanism called cessio bonorum, the voluntary formal surrender of assets to creditors. The moment a Roman citizen invoked it, they entered a different social category. Future contracts became harder to obtain. Institutional trust evaporated. The reputational damage outlasted the debt itself, sometimes by decades. Creditors remembered. Potential partners remembered. The social memory of financial vulnerability proved in Rome, as in most subsequent cultures, both long and inconveniently precise. We are not so different. There is a particular kind of well-intentioned mistake that people make when they are under financial pressure. They tell someone the full picture: a colleague over lunch, a sibling at a family gathering, an old friend over drinks, the complete inventory, the balance on the credit card, the months of runway remaining, the investment that did not perform as planned, the creditor whose communications have acquired an uncomfortable tone. The motivation is relief, and that motivation is entirely human. Carrying a financial burden alone is genuinely difficult. The psychological weight of undisclosed stress, maintained consistently over weeks and months, is real and significant. The impulse to share it with someone who might listen, who might understand, who might simply sit with you in it, is not a weakness of character. But the information, once shared, does something the person sharing it rarely anticipates. It begins to function as the primary frame through which that person is understood, sometimes permanently. Not the frame of who they are across years of demonstrated capability, of past accomplishments, of future potential. The frame of this difficulty, disclosed at this moment, retained by a memory that did not ask permission before filing it under a category that will affect how every subsequent interaction is processed. People start to wonder, quietly, about judgment, about whether this person is the right choice for a partnership, a promotion, a responsibility that requires someone in a stable position to absorb it. They factor the disclosed vulnerability into their assessments, and that calculation rarely resolves in the discloser's favor, even among people who genuinely wish them well and consciously intend no harm. The survivors of financial difficulty across history share one consistent trait. They managed the narrative around their position as carefully as they managed the position itself. The practical discipline is this: you share the specifics of financial difficulty with advisors, with professionals, with trusted people whose active counsel you are seeking and whose discretion you have concrete, specific reason to trust. You do not distribute it to social contexts, where it will be retained independently of your timeline, assessed against standards that have nothing to do with your circumstances, and applied to judgments about you that will persist long after you have moved forward, because the memory of others is not calibrated to your recovery. They will remember the moment of disclosure long after you have resolved the underlying condition, and they will apply that memory to assessments of you that have nothing to do with the original context. The fourth thing you should never reveal is your plans before they have become real. In the spring of 1893, Nikola Tesla gave a public interview in which he described, in considerable detail, his plans for wireless power transmission, the concept, the proposed mechanism, the commercial implications he believed it carried, the timeline he envisioned, the scale of the ambition. The interview was published widely. Competitors read it carefully. Financiers who had been cautiously interested now had a complete picture of what Tesla intended, and a clear basis for calculating whether it aligned with their own interests or threatened them. J.P. Morgan, who had already expressed reservations about certain aspects of Tesla's vision, now had the full architecture of the plan and the ability to reason precisely about its commercial implications relative to other investments he was actively considering. Tesla did not lose his ideas in that interview. He lost something more difficult to recover: his informational advantage. The gap between what he knew and what his environment knew had been closed, and with it, a range of strategic options closed as well. Options that depend on moving in an environment that does not yet fully understand what you are doing, or why, or what it might cost them. The psychological research on premature plan disclosure is worth understanding carefully, because the mechanism operates below the level most people examine. When people articulate a goal to others and receive social acknowledgement, even a mild, politely interested response, the brain registers something that resembles partial completion. Not full completion, but partial. The announcement substitutes, to a degree the research finds surprisingly significant, for some portion of the motivational drive that should push toward actual execution. The urgency decreases. The energy that should fuel work gets spent, in part, in the social transaction of being understood and received. This effect operates most powerfully on people who are most naturally communicative and socially engaged. Precisely the people who share plans most readily and most enthusiastically, and who therefore most need to know about it. But there is a second mechanism, less psychological and more tactical, and in many ways more consequential for the long term. Early disclosure of plans invites the constant background presence of other people's expectations, unsolicited modifications, honest doubts, and well-intentioned additions. People begin asking for progress updates at intervals you did not invite. They offer suggestions that introduce noise into your thinking at precisely the stage when clarity is most essential. They calibrate their expectations of you against the plan you described, not the one you are actually executing, which is always, inevitably, a different thing, because contact with reality always requires adjustment. And when plans change, as all serious plans must, you must now manage the gap between what you announced and what you are doing. That management consumes energy that belongs entirely to execution. Share the plan with the people who have a direct material role in executing it, not for inspiration, not for accountability you did not specifically request, only for execution. The fifth thing you should never reveal is the specific architecture of your past failures. There is a modern tendency to valorize the public performance of failure. The language of learning from mistakes has migrated, somewhere in the last decade, from a private discipline into a public genre. People recount losses, wrong decisions, and financial mistakes in professional forums and social platforms as though the act of disclosure is itself the lesson. I want to be precise here, because there is an important distinction this tendency tends to obscure. Processing failures carefully, with trusted advisors or mentors who hold your full context and whose judgment you are specifically seeking. That is genuinely valuable. It is how difficult experience becomes useful knowledge. The Roman Stoics understood this. Seneca's letters are full of it. The examination of failure in contexts of appropriate trust produces insight. Distributing the narrative of failures widely, in contexts where the audience does not hold your full story, does not know the surrounding circumstances, and will retain the specific failure long after you have moved past it. That is a different activity entirely, with different consequences. In 18th century London, the commercial culture of the merchant class operated on a principle that sounds severe by modern standards, but carried genuine practical wisdom. Your past financial failures were your own business. The degree to which you disclosed them in social contexts was understood to be a direct measure of your judgment, not about those failures, but about information management generally. A merchant who casually narrated his past defaults at supper was communicating something about his operational discretion that other merchants took seriously and remembered. Not because failure was shameful. Failure, in commercial culture, was understood as a near universal condition. Most merchants failed at least once. Many failed repeatedly before succeeding substantially. The archives make that clear, beyond any reasonable dispute. But the map of your past failures, once distributed, becomes permanently available to people who may use it in ways you cannot predict, at moments you cannot choose, in contexts that have nothing to do with the original conversation in which you shared it. It constructs, in the minds of those who receive it, a model of your reliability that persists independently of your current capabilities, your current resources, and your current circumstances. You do not deny facts in formal contexts that require accurate disclosure. A lender assessing a credit application is entitled to accurate information. A business partner conducting structured due diligence is entitled to material facts that bear on their decision. These are appropriate contexts, and accuracy in them is both required and right. A dinner party is not a due diligence process, and the person across the table is not making a formal assessment with your interests and theirs in proper structural alignment. The historical actors who recovered most effectively from financial difficulty were, without exception, precise about the contexts in which they disclosed it, and deliberate about the contexts in which they did not. The sixth thing you should never reveal is how money makes you feel. This category is almost never recognized as financial information, but it is among the most operationally significant information you can disclose, because it is not a description of your position. It is a map of your decision-making vulnerabilities. The anxiety that rises when your account balance approaches a certain threshold. The specific categories of spending that carry a weight of shame or compulsion or confused pride that you have never quite examined clearly. The financial fears that operate below the level of explicit decision-making. The ones that cause you to move too quickly and accept unfavorable terms in some situations, and to freeze entirely and miss genuine opportunities in others. These are not abstract psychological curiosities. They are a precise technical map of where and how you can be navigated by anyone who has access to that map and understands, even intuitively, how to use it. In the court politics of 17th century Europe, in Versailles, in the Stuart court, in the Habsburg administration, knowledge of a minister's specific financial anxieties was among the most sought-after intelligence available to rivals and to those who wished to manage political outcomes. Not because it would necessarily be deployed immediately or dramatically, but because it created an option held indefinitely and at essentially no cost, to structure situations in which the targeted person would make predictable, disadvantageous decisions without realizing they were being navigated into them. Options are cheap to hold and expensive to be on the wrong side of. Modern negotiators understand this at an intuitive level, even when they do not articulate it as a principle. The counterparty, who knows you are under cash flow pressure, will structure an offer with payment terms that exploit that pressure in ways that are entirely legal, entirely invisible in the moment, and entirely predictable in their effect. The family member who has identified, through accumulated casual conversation, your specific financial insecurities will find it far easier to frame requests in ways that work with those insecurities rather than against them. Not necessarily with conscious intent, often without any intent at all. Human beings navigate toward the openings that exist. That is simply how social cognition functions. This is not a counsel against understanding your own emotional relationship with money. That understanding is valuable and worth cultivating with genuine honesty. It is a counsel about where you cultivate it and with whom. With a qualified financial advisor, whose professional role is to help you make better decisions in full possession of your complete picture. With a therapist, if the patterns run deep enough to affect your capacity for clear choice. In private reflection. In contexts specifically designed to hold that level of honesty safely and productively, where the information is protected by structure and by the explicit commitments of the people receiving it. In casual, social, or professional contexts, the feelings are private operating data. They are not the currency of intimacy you sometimes mistake them for in a vulnerable moment. They are a technical map. And technical maps belong in the hands of people who will use them to help you, not in the general circulation of a social world where they will simply become available. The seventh thing you should never reveal, and this is the one that most people in this particular era find most counterintuitive, is the detail of your daily pattern, your schedule, your predictable whereabouts, your consistent movements and rhythms across days and weeks and seasons of the year. Before the era of continuous social documentation, the disclosure of your schedule was understood to carry weight. It was information you shared selectively, for specific purposes, with specific people who needed it. In the mid-20th century, advertising where you would be, when, and for how long, in context beyond direct necessity, was still considered something a thoughtful person did with some deliberation. The instinct that schedule was private information persisted into living memory. The erosion of that instinct has happened so gradually, and the social incentives for continuous self-documentation have become so normalized that most people no longer notice the extraordinarily detailed informational environment they now maintain around themselves as a matter of routine. The morning post from the coffee shop, the travel update from the airport, the offhand remark about the deadline pressing on Wednesday, the meeting consuming Thursday morning, the trip planned for the following week. Each piece is trivial individually. Assembled, they are a precise operational portrait. Your schedule is a map of your priorities, your vulnerabilities, and your predictable behaviors across time. And maps are useful to people who want to navigate around you, or intercept you, or time their approaches for moments when you are least equipped to evaluate them carefully. The financial dimension of this is more significant than it initially appears. When people know your schedule with precision, they know when you are stretched thin between competing obligations, and therefore less deliberate in your assessments. They know when you are away from your normal environment, operating with slightly less information and slightly more reliance on expedience. They know the periods in your year, the weeks before a major deadline, the days following a significant transaction, the seasons when your attention is distributed across multiple simultaneous demands, when you are most likely to make decisions you will later recognize as hasty. And they can time their approaches accordingly. Meet Elena, 52 years old, runs a small business, routinely posts her schedule and travel plans across several social platforms. Over 18 months, she has received 3 significant business proposals, all timed to arrive during the week before her annual tax deadline, when she is demonstrably under pressure. 2 of them contained terms she agreed to and later reconsidered when she had time to examine them properly. She cannot prove the timing was deliberate. She also cannot prove it was coincidence. The Roman legions had a tactical doctrine that translates almost directly to this principle. The side that knows more about the opponent's dispositions, timeline, and predictable movements holds the initiative. It can choose the moment. The side that is fully understood at the operational level cannot choose the moment. It can only respond. That doctrine held in the campaigns of the Republic. It holds, in its quieter civilian version, in the practical negotiations of daily professional and personal life. The practical application is not paranoia. It is not the refusal of all social transparency. It is simply the recognition that your calendar is not a social document. Your travel plans are not status updates. Your daily pattern is operational information. And operational information performs best when its circulation is limited to people who need it specifically in order to serve your interests directly. 7 categories, and a principle that threads through all of them. Not secrecy as a posture. Not withdrawal from meaningful relationship. Not the refusal of the genuine intimacy that makes a life worth living. The principle is that information is not neutral. Every disclosure you make changes the informational environment around you. And the informational environment around you shapes what other people can do, what they believe about you, what options they hold in relation to you, options you may never know they are holding. Voltaire, late in his life, wrote extensively in his private correspondence about this, in ways that tend to surprise people who know him primarily as a man of extraordinary public candor. His private letters are full of careful observations about what he chose not to say, to whom, and why. His public brilliance was possible, he suggested in several of those letters, in part because his private operations were carefully maintained. The candor was real. So was the discipline that surrounded and protected it. This is not a lesson about distrust. It is a lesson about appropriateness, about what information belongs in which context, and what the cost of mismatching that is. The people closest to you, in sustained relationships of genuine mutual commitment built across real time and real shared experience, earn access to different categories of information. That is precisely what the depth of a real relationship means, and it is worth protecting by not mistaking every interaction for one of equal depth and equal trust. Everyone else, colleagues, acquaintances, extended family, the broad social environment, the ambient audience of modern life, operates on a different principle: purposeful information. You share what serves the actual purpose of the interaction. You reserve, quietly and without drama, what does not. The most sophisticated financial act is not a complex investment strategy. It is not a clever restructuring of assets, or finding the right instrument at the right moment in a favorable cycle. It is the calm, deliberate management of what others know about you, because what others know about you shapes what they can do to you. It shapes what they believe you are capable of and what you owe. It shapes what options they carry into every interaction they have with you, including interactions you will never know took place, in rooms you were not in, about decisions whose connection to that one disclosure you made 2 years ago over dinner you will never trace. The prudent person, in an age that has confused disclosure with authenticity and oversharing with honesty, does not ask what to hide. They ask consistently and quietly, what does this context genuinely require of me? And what belongs only to me? That question, asked and answered carefully over time, with discipline and without drama, is worth more than most financial strategies I have encountered in 3,000 years of the historical record. The Medici knew it. Rockefeller knew it. The Roman merchants knew it in language older than the empire itself. Now you know it too. History is a strict teacher. It repeats the lesson until the student absorbs it. Today, as always, I merely read the open book of human experience. I am Valerius Sage.